Hey there, it's me, Andrew Chang, and you're watching About That, the show that's all about explaining and expanding on the news. And today we're going to talk about the R word, recession. I know, I hate it too, but we got it. You know why? Because the only way out of a recession is through it. And you know, we had a lot of questions about what a recession actually is, so we thought, why not ask and answer some of those questions together? So let's go ahead and start where, you know, a lot of questions start, Google. And when I did a Google image search on the word recession, because like I'm fun like that, something that looked like this was one of the first results to pop up. And it's pretty scary, right? And not just because I think this is what you would get if you mated an arrow with a silverback gorilla, but also, like, the scariest part about this, I think, is not just that it's pointed down, it's that on the way down, you don't actually know where it's going to go next. And like, what does down even mean, for that matter? Like, down in what exactly? So today, we're not going to make any guesses about, you know, the start date of a recession, how long it'll last or when it'll end, but we are going to demystify exactly what it means to be in a recession, and maybe most importantly, and this is what we'll spend the most time on during this program, how to plan for and survive a recession. But to understand the recession, we must become the recession, or at least get what it means. Okay, so what are we doing here? Recession defined. So the technical definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. And we can break that down so it's not so mysterious. A quarter, we all know what that is, right? Just a simple way of dividing up the calendar year of 12 months into 4 equal parts of 3 months each. So 2 quarters is 6 months. But 6 months of negative growth, that's a weird one, right? All we mean when we say that is a decline in the economy. And we measure that decline with something called the gross domestic product, or the GDP. That's most often how we refer to it as. And all that is the total market value of all the goods and services produced within a country. Now, if your eyes just kind of glazed right over, hang with me, it's actually really easy to explain. If you imagine all of the stuff that we make in Canada, so, you know, crops, cars, oil and gas, anything made or mined in this country, but also think about all of those service-based industries. So real estate, restaurants, even the guy who cuts your hair. If you put all of that stuff together and you add up what it's worth, that's what we mean when we say gross domestic product. Now, Canada's GDP last year was something like $2 trillion. I think it was actually like $1.9 trillion. And that's the number we use chiefly to try to gauge, try to measure how strong a country's economy actually is. So when you have 6 months of that kind of a decline in the GDP, that's when you have a recession. Okay, so crystal clear, right? But what does it mean? Like, how do 2 quarters of negative growth actually affect your life? Well, we asked Robert McEwen, an economics professor from York University in Toronto.
Well, it might not mean very much. 2 consecutive periods of negative economic growth might not be that important to the majority of Canadians. The biggest impact is that some people may lose their jobs, or they will lose their jobs. The other impact is that some people will find it more difficult to find work. There will be fewer opportunities to work overtime. Employers may offer fewer shifts than someone would like. And so the labor market is very important when we're entering a recession.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? Eyes on the job market. Not everyone will lose their jobs, but some people will. So now let's go one step deeper. Why some and not others?
Some people will go through a recession and they won't notice very much change in their life at all. Other people will go into a recession and they will lose their job, maybe because the company's profits are down and they need to cut their expenses, or maybe it's an industry that's particularly sensitive to recessions and consumer demand. And so the reason why recessions are so bad for Canadians is that you can't really be sure if the recession is going to affect you or not. And if it does affect you, it could reduce your income and your standard of living by quite a bit.
Right. And if we just emphasize one more thing, why do recessions affect some companies more than others? Let's cue the part of this clip where he answers that very question.
Or maybe it's an industry that's particularly sensitive to recessions and consumer demand.
That's it. Industries sensitive to consumer demand. Those are often industries that rely on discretionary spending, so things you don't need to buy, which makes sense as folks feel a little less job secure and they tighten their belts. So here's what we're going to do, a little recession planning 101, because if Robert didn't make it abundantly clear in his first answer, it's not like some magical light switch flicks off during a recession and changes everything. Writ large, it's a lot more gradual than that, a lot more subtle than that, which means the way that you and I should react to a recession doesn't actually have to involve some dramatic 180. And as I learned from speaking with a financial counselor, being ready for a recession actually just means doubling down on a lot of the stuff that we should generally be thinking about anyway. You're going to hear more about that after this. Hey there, good to have you back. Okay, so let's recap. We've defined what a recession actually is, and we've explained a little bit of what it means to be in a recession, like in human terms. And if after all of that, you've been left feeling even just the slightest bit anxious, I don't blame you one bit, because we've been hearing stuff like this for quite a while now.
We are relearning the corrosive effects of inflation in society. And yeah, people are frustrated. They feel helpless.
So let's spend a bit more time, the rest of the program, in fact, on some of the ways we can actually cushion ourselves from the impact of a recession. And the good news is that it's not really all that complicated. So I had the pleasure of sitting down with a financial counselor, Jessica Moorhouse, who is a sort of a self-styled millennial money expert. And we talked essentially mapping out a battle plan. Here it is. Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good.
We don't know each other.
No, we just met.
But we are actually going to talk about something like pretty personal.
Oh, I talk about this all the time. So it's
Yeah.
I like going deep and personal with strangers all the time
You know,
when it comes to money.
Right. Yeah. Well, you're the professional here, right?
Yeah.
And so start with this. Like what is this kind of like mystical property to money where like it's almost like health, right? Where sometimes it's not comfortable talking about it.
I think it's because when we think of money, we automatically associate it with our own success level and personal identity.
And I guess, I mean, like you have to make a lot of tough decisions too, right? Like I think about like this coffee, for example. I bet there's going to be a lot of people out there who would go bonkers if they hear one more person say, well, if you want to manage your money properly, you can't be doing stuff like this.
It's like, listen, not buying a latte is not gonna make or break your living. And I think here's the thing about that, because I do want to address that. It's not about the latte.
But
it's
I
just
guess,
about being intentional with where your money is going. But people love to talk about avocado toast and lattes.
Yeah, they glom
and that
onto
is not why
right?
millennials cannot afford them. Okay?
Right, because I guess the thinking is, I mean, every little bit counts, right?
Sure.
And it takes a lot of little pieces, a lot of
But
little
you can have your
moves like
lattes, but maybe cut back in an area that that isn't really valuable to you. So it's really about like really defining what do you value. And some people are like, listen, I love my latte. It's something I get excited about every single day. Then keep that in your life if it brings you joy. But if it's hindering you from reaching your goals, where else can we look in your budget to cut back so you can reach that goal?
Right. So I guess here's where my mind goes, because, on the one hand, it's yes, everyone wants to be penny wise, but we don't want to spend all of our effort there and be pound foolish on the other side of the room. So what are some of the bigger moves that a person can make, especially in the time of a recession, to kind of safeguard their financial picture, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And so the number one thing I say to people is, you need to have a plan, and no one likes the term budget, so you can give it whatever name you want, spending plan, money plan, whatever you want, so you'll actually look at it. But it's really, think of it more as a way for you to decide, how should I allocate the income that I've got? The money that's coming in, where can I put it?
How rigorous would a budget need to be useful? Like,
No,
are you
not
talking
rigorous
about?
at all.
So, because when you say budget, I think you're tracking every dollar in,
Well, you can be.
every dollar out. Yeah, of course you can.
If
right?
you want. But the first budget that I ever created, and I still have it because I'm a nerd and I have all my documents from like 2010, it was very simple. All it was my gross income, my net income, my expenses, and I think a few of my like savings buckets, as I call it back then.
And what do you learn when you go through that exercise? Because I can imagine a lot of people who don't actively, consciously budget the money that they have coming in and out. They would say, no, like I know what I spend my money on.
It's like, do you though? No one does. If you don't track it, if you don't have it written down, if you don't take some time to think about it, you're guessing. And that's what I did for a long time. I didn't track my expenses back then, so I have no idea where my money actually went. I had my budget of what I wanted to happen with my money, and I stuck to that pretty closely, honestly, because I really didn't have that much money, so every dollar really counted. But then as I started earning more money, and you kind of get a little complacent and lazy, and you're like, it's fine. And then you're like, why do I have $2,000 on my Visa card? Like, what is that? And then you're like, oh yeah. And then it sadly always adds up. And you're like, okay, well, this isn't working. So you need to track where the money is going to be able to identify the problem areas.
Hey, it's me. In hindsight, I thought this might be a good moment to talk about what budgeting method works for me. So, for a while, I used a very simplistic method of breaking up my income, which is called the 50-30-20 rule. And basically what it means is that 50% of your take-home pay is devoted to essential expenses. So, think things like your house, rent, mortgage, whatever, food, anything that's non-negotiable. 30% of your income is dedicated to the fun stuff, discretionary expenses. So eating out, going snowboarding, buying balloons, whatever you want. And then 20% is for savings. Now, I can't say that I always hit these targets, but it was always a good way of thinking about money. Now, I do a much more intense form of zero-based budgeting, where I take my income and I essentially give every dollar a job, so that after I've made my plan, I literally have $0 left. Now, sitting in a bank account, by the way, counts as a job. So it's not like I'm spending all of my money, but the point is that if I overspend in a category, so let's say I've only allocated $30 a month for eating out, but I spend $40, I have to subtract money from another category in order to get back to zero. So with this method, you're not actually allowed to overspend and go negative. It just forces you to constantly weigh your priorities when you spend or when you spend too much. Lots of budgeting software out there helps you track this. Some can even link directly with your bank accounts and track your transactions for you. Could be worth checking out. You mentioned credit cards. The Visa card. And of course, that can be like a black hole where money disappears, not only because you spend so freely, but because so much of what you do spend, if you're not careful, gets eaten up by interest.
It can be, yes. And that's the one thing that when I'm talking to someone and they feel really unorganized and anxious about their money, typically it's because they do have credit cards and they have balances on them. And it's a very easy cycle to get into. You just like, oh, you know what, I'll just pay the minimum balance this time because I'm a bit short. I'll get it next time.
How do you, because no one wants to be in debt, right? They don't intentionally set out to put themselves in that sort of a situation. And yet, after a long period of time, they might find that, geez, I owe $400 on a 19% credit card. I owe $13,000 on a maybe lower percentage car loan, and then I owe $200,000 on a 4% mortgage.
Or like student debt.
Sure, right? Yeah, like I haven't even talked. So how do you recommend kind of tackling those? Like, do you base it on the amount of money that is owed? You tackle those first? Is it based on the percentage?
So really what you got to do though, unfortunately, is you got to attack it head on, and you've got to take a look at everything that's, what are all the different debts, categorize and be like, okay, what are the interest rates? What are the balances? And then figure out what's the best strategy for me. So there's a couple.
How do you figure that out?
Well, there's two main strategies. Yeah. Well, there's really three. One, if you just want to focus on paying it off, you can do the debt snowball or the debt avalanche. Debt avalanche, which is probably...
Neither of which sounds pleasant, by the way.
I know, because they have the word debt in them. Well, actually, yeah, they're both snowballing and avalanching you. They're both a bit like, wait a minute, these are natural disasters, aren't they?
No matter which option
yeah, they don't sound fun. I wish there was a better term for them. So that's the other thing. If you don't like a term, switch the term, call it something else, right? Yeah. So debt avalanche is really categorizing it and prioritizing paying off your debt in the sequence of what has the highest rate of interest.
Right.
And so whatever has, if it's your credit
No
card,
matter what the dollar amount is.
it doesn't matter. Focus on the interest, and then, you know, once that's paid off, move on to the next. You're always paying the minimum balances, of course, on all of your debts,
right,
but aggressively paying off the one with higher interest. The logic is you're going to be saving a lot more money because you're paying off the one that is costing you the most in interest. So long term, you're going to be saving more money in interest. Most people actually don't choose that. They choose debt snowball. It does make more psychological sense. It's just easier to grasp. You're going to attack the one with the smallest balance because you can probably pay that off a lot quicker, especially if it's like $400. You can get it done in a month or a couple months. You're like, oh, now I'm down to 3 debts, not 4.
Right.
Oh, wow, I
Right.
feel like the burden is easing up a little bit.
But you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, the advantage with the snowball is psychological.
Psychological.
But
It will.
not
it may not
financial. Not
it
by the
may
numbers.
cost you
It
more
doesn't.
in interest, and it may
Right.
take you a little bit longer. But there's also like just that behavioral economics portion. It's like you just
sure.
may lose steam and motivation, and so that's why most people choose that method. The other thing that you of course can do though, and I would say, you know, even before you choose one of those methods, see if you can do this. Is there a way that we can consolidate some of your debts? Do a balance transfers. I mean, it depends on the debts, of course, but you can roll them into your mortgage, home equity line of credit, things like that. And if you do that, typically, again, it depends on what kind of debts you have. You will have an overall lower interest rate. And so you can, again, you're going to be saving a lot more money in interest, can hopefully pay off your debts a lot
Is there
quicker.
any downside to
Of
doing
course. When it's all consolidated into one, it can look like a really big amount.
Sure.
And again, psychologically, it could be way too difficult to actually
To feel like you're chipping
recognize
away
that
at it,
you're
right?
you're making a dent into that.
Right. And I guess so the ultimate goal of doing any or all of those things would be to actually have enough money that you can set aside
Yeah.
in some sort of way that can act as, I guess, a cushion.
Yes.
Right? In case things do go sideways, as they sometimes do
Yeah.
during a recession.
Well, that's typically why people get into debt is they didn't have a cushion, and life happens, and life always happens. And so that is why I always tell people, even before paying off debt aggressively, before that, have an emergency fund. So the best thing you could do is to have some cash in the bank for when something happens, because it always will. You think it might be useless, but as someone who's gone through a lot of ups and downs, unemployment, things breaking down, a big, appliance, you're like, oh gosh, we need a new fridge or something like that. Things always pop up, and you're so glad. You'll never regret having an emergency fund, but I can understand when you're like, all right, let's get to our finances. I've got all these really big priorities. It can be annoying to be like, wait, you say the first priority is putting cash in the high interest savings account and not touching it? That's boring. I want to get to the action. I get it.
Speaking of action, size matters when it comes to the emergency fund.
Sure does. Just like other things, but emergency fund size is so important.
What is the right size?
Well, the kind of typical rule of thumb you hear is between 3 and 6 months of your living expenses. I like to do living expenses because first, it'll force you to create a budget, because that's the only way you're going to find out your living expenses, writing down how much it costs to live.
Sure.
But also then you will know that if I get laid off, I have enough money for 3 to 6 months, especially if you don't
survive,
have,
right?
Yeah,
So
to
we're
survive.
talking food, shelter.
You want it to cover everything, your variable and your fixed expense. So you want it to cover your necessities, all of your bills, but also, groceries and other things that may come up that you need to pay for in the interim when you are trying to figure out how to make income or waiting for your EI to kick in or something like that.
Right. We've talked an awful lot about saving money, but it's like the old saying, right? Like there are two ways to generate more cash flow. You either save more money or you make more money. Can we talk about the make more money?
Ideally you do both. I mean,
Sure.
Going back to the emergency fund, the reason I was actually able to save my first one when I was earning like hardly any money in my mid-20s was I had a second job, because I did not earn enough in my first job to have enough to really make any progress saving up cash for my emergency fund. So I had to earn more money. And so for me, I actually, so during the day I had a 9 to 5, worked for a newspaper, and my kind of second job, I moonlit as on sometimes during the week, sometimes weekends, as a teleprompter operator for the news. Very random job, and it was actually very stressful. And I'm so glad I don't have to do it again. Honestly, I have nightmares sometimes that I'm still doing that job. It's very hard. But I did that job for 3 years on top of my full-time job, and I'm so glad that I had this extra stream of income that was helped me save up that emergency fund. And then once I kind of got to that number that made me happy, I can shift it. I'm like, okay, where are we going to put this money now? Didn't have any student debt, didn't have,
right.
And so I started investing and growing my wealth. So having an extra way to earn money can be a game changer for most people.
It's one of those things, though, that's like easier said than done.
Oh, I know.
Right?
Gosh, yeah.
Because hustle culture is big.
I know.
Right? And of course we always hear about the gig economy, and so what are you saying? Like that I should be making Uber Eats trips on the side whenever I can, or driving whenever I can? It's not possible.
It may not be possible for most people, especially if you have dependents.
Of course.
And just depending on what your lifestyle is. I hate that the term side hustle, which kind of was like a cool new thing, has now become the norm. You have to have one. But what I will say is, especially if you're very resistant to the idea of getting a second job, and again, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a thing that you start on your own. It could be like me. I worked for a company as my second job, so you can always do that. It can be temporary, but still, it's like it was easy money, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But it was temporary, and eventually I left. So you can start it, and then you're like, I've met my goal. I have my emergency fund. I've got my debt. I don't think I need this extra income. You can leave.
You mentioned investing a few moments ago, and it kind of made me wonder. Is there good news in any of this, in these times? I mean, that we find ourselves in, a silver lining or like an opportunity?
Oh yeah, that's the thing. One of the biggest lessons I learned in the last recession, and that's when I started investing. Yes, there is risk, but it's not just it's all risky. It's like, well, it depends on where your money's going and what kind of risk are you taking. There's risk inherent in every form of investing in the stock market and the bond market, but you can be calculated about it. And there's lots of ways to mitigate that risk. This can be a great time to actually get investing.
Now, this is where the interview gets really interesting, because investing is a topic that we are going to revisit later this week with Jessica. So if the world of stocks and bonds and compound interest sounds daunting to you, we'll have you covered. But we do got to wrap up, and we'll be back with a final thought. Hey there, welcome back. I've got a latte here. It doesn't matter where it's from. But I have this because it's sort of interesting to think about how we value something like this, a daily purchase. And also, I was kind of giving Jessica a hard time about coffees and such. But there's a part of the value of, if you buy one of these every day, there's a part of the value of this that I can't really help you determine, because it's your own enjoyment, right? You get whatever pleasure you get out of something like this. I can't help you calculate the back end, though. So the amount of money that you would spend on something like this and what you could get out of it if you were to spend that money differently. So this is $5.59 all in. If you bought this 5 days a week, that works out to $28 a week, roughly. If you did that every week of the year, you'd be spending close to $1,500 on the latte every year. Now, let's say instead you took $1,500 and you invested it at a 6% annual rate of return. After 20 years, if you did that every year, you'd end up with about $50,000. That's according to an investment calculator here. If you did that for 30 years, you'd end up with $115,000. And if you did that every 40 years, for 40 years, I should say, you'd end up with $224,000. So just a different way of measuring the value of a cup of coffee. Thanks for joining us here on the program. It's been fun. Take care.